Welcome back. All right, here is our third video in introducing the dynamic aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. In the first video, we talked about what is dynamic, what that is used to derive the aggregate demand curve from the dynamic quantity theory of money equation that is brought forth to us by the monetarist school. And then we also, in the second video, derived the long-run aggregate supply curve, and that's brought forth by the real business cycle theory. And then now we're going to talk about the aggregate supply model. And the aggregate supply model is going to introduce a theory of sticky prices and sticky wages. Okay, so when we do this part here, the main idea about this is sticky prices and sticky wages. Okay. Now, why is it sticky prices and sticky wages? Well, it's also means that there is going to be some adaptation over time. We're going to have a shock to aggregate demand or a shock to long-run aggregate supply. Okay. In either case, when you have those shocks, you're going to be affecting the inflation rate. Okay, and so the inflation rate will go up or will go down. Okay, but the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, the aggregate supply curve of that, it's also known as the short-run aggregate supply model. It's based on an expected inflation rate. Okay. So when we're driving our short-run aggregate supply model, we're going to have some type of situation where short-run aggregate supply is based on, say, an expected inflation rate of 2%. Now, why is the expected inflation rate 2%? Well, it's because maybe inflation has been at 2% for a long time, and that's just what people expect. Maybe their central bank has a monetary policy rule to target a 2% inflation rate, and because that rule is credible, people continue to expect that. And so when there's a shock, they will update their inflation expectations upward if it is a positive shock for aggregate demand, or a negative shock for long-run aggregate supply, or they'll update it downwards if it is a positive shock, negative shock to aggregate demand, or a positive shock to long-run aggregate supply. So you'll see more of that when we start to shift the curves, but I just want to let you know that that is based on this expectation. Now, the sticky prices and sticky wages are stickier downward. Okay, stickier downward, okay? What that means is that prices can rise like a rocket and fall like a feather. But that doesn't mean it's instant. Prices are still sticky upwards. Wages are still sticky upwards, but they're much stickier on the downside. And so there's this reluctance of businesses to lower their prices even though they're still having items on the shelf, but they'll eventually lower those prices. But they're even more hesitant to lower people's nominal wages of the workers that they're hiring. And the reason that they're worried about that is they're worried about worker morale. So the idea is that if people see cuts to their paychecks, they may not work as hard, they may be disgruntled, they may even sabotage the company's work. And so it is better for them to just go ahead and lay off a few workers to cut their costs and just have all that bad morale go out the door, okay? All right, so what does this mean? Well, what the short run aggregate supply curve is going to do is essentially map out a series of short run equilibriums for the economy in responses to positive and negative shocks to aggregate demand or long run aggregate supply. Okay. All right, so here's our inflation rate. Here's our real GDP growth rate. And we've got a short run aggregate supply curve that is bent. It is steeper, it is flatter on the downside and steeper on the upside. Okay. And if we pick a starting point, say this was our long run macro equilibrium of a 2% inflation rate and a 3% real GDP growth rate, then if people are expecting an inflation rate of 2%, then if there's a negative shock to long run aggregate supply, or particularly a negative shock to aggregate demand, then people are going to want to lower their prices. The firms are going to want to lower their prices. But they will be hesitant to lower the wages. Okay, so that will cause all prices to not fall as quickly. So you're going to have some disinflation, but it's going to come at a much larger expense of real GDP growth. So if we end up, say, down at this point here, we may only get a 1% drop in inflation, but we'll get a 3 points drop in real GDP growth. Okay. Now on the right side, if we say have a positive aggregate demand shock, and that would move us up to a short run equilibrium up here, we're going to get not much of a change in real growth. We might get a 1% increase in real growth, but we might have a 2% increase in the inflation rate. Okay, and so again, that's the idea that we have these sticky prices because people have these inflation expectations. When they're wrong about their expectations, prices are going to adjust downward when the inflation rate is actually going to be lower than what they expected. And that will take more time. It will result in a bigger shock to output. But when they they experience higher inflation than expected, they'll actually adjust more quickly because it'll be easier for firms to offer wage increases because the prices they receive for their product are also increasing. Okay, let's go ahead and put the model together here. So let's make the 3% our long run aggregate supply curve associated with that solo growth rate, that long run growth rate of 3%. And then let's throw in our aggregate demand curve that's associated with a spending growth rate of 5%. Now, if we were to shift the aggregate demand curve out to the right, then we would have what is called a positive shock. Okay? Now, if this is a positive shock in the Keynesian sense, then it's going to be a shock to V. Okay? And so the Keynesian school, I'm just going to say Keynesians for short, comes from the father of macroeconomics, John Maynard Keynes, and he talks about this notion of animal spirits. That we're not, sometimes not, rational humans, but we're just like animals that succumb to waves of pessimism and waves of optimism. All right, so if you're optimistic, then your velocity growth rate is going to increase, okay? And if you're pessimistic, your velocity growth rate is going to decrease, okay? And so that would be associated with these positive aggregate demand shock. Suppose this AD curve is now associated with a, say, 8% spending growth rate. And then we have this negative aggregate demand shock, and that's associated with a negative 1% spending rate. Okay, so if we have this wave of optimism and we shift our aggregate demand curve to the right, then we're going to have a new short-run equilibrium here, okay? And so let's just say that this is a 4% real GDP growth rate, and that would result in a 4% inflation rate. Okay. So in this case, we increased our growth rate by 1%, but we increased our inflation rate by 2%. And the gap, the increase in spending growth rate is 3 percentage points. Okay. All right, now, suppose we have a wave of pessimism. And our spending growth actually is decreasing by 1% there, okay? So what that means is that what we have here plus what we have here must be negative 1%. So we're going to say that we have a 1% inflation rate and a negative 2% real GDP growth rate. So 1 plus negative 2 would give us negative 1. Okay? So it's really important that the equilibrium that you find yourself on, whether it's a short-run equilibrium or a long-run equilibrium, whether it's a long-run equilibrium or a short-run equilibrium, that is, that that the inflation rate plus the real growth rate equals the spending growth rate. Okay. All right. So the question now is, okay, well, where are these animal spirits manifesting? Okay. Well, if you remember our equation for spending for GDP, we have Y equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So a shock to V could come from any one of these components. Usually it starts in an investment shock. Say there's a stock market crash or a asset bubble pop, such as the housing market. And that would cause a decrease in investment, and then that would also cause a decrease in consumption spending. Because if the stock market does worse, then people's, their portfolios will be lower value, so there'll be a negative wealth effect. So people will kind of cut back, expecting their future wealth to go down. Okay. So the question remains, and we'll leave this for the next video, is what happens next? Are we going to stay in the short-run equilibrium? Are we going to go to this long-run equilibrium, or are we going to find a new long-run equilibrium? Okay, and it actually depends upon what type of aggregate demand shock that you have. Okay, And so we'll leave you in mystery for the next video.